If you were to ask any football fan, young or old, what country first springs to mind with the prompt international football, you would receive the answer Brazil 100% of the time. They've won the most FIFA World Cups and appeared at all 21 editions of the tournament, sure, but it's something more than that as to why they've become so ubiquitous on the world stage. We expect something a little bit more special from Brazil. Every time the World Cup comes around, whether or not Brazil have a functional squad with the odd superstar, a poor squad, or comfortably the best team in the tournament, they will be ranked as the favourites to win it. They are the land of Joga Bonito, the beautiful game. They have won the World Cup the most spectacular, as they had done in 1970. They are one of two nations to have retained the World Cup. Yet they've not always played to type. For every Pelé and Garrincha or Socrates and Zico, there's a Dunga or a Felipe Melo. For every artistic failure or glorious procession, there's a gross underachievement or a winning in the ugly manner. Brazil are not what they seem. They are currently on their second longest run without a World Cup trophy, stuck on 5 titles, whilst the European powerhouses of Germany and Italy, as well as the more frightening prospect of Argentina, catch them up. They've played beautifully at times in the past 20 years, they've been successful occasionally too, but the constant war at the centre of Brazilian football is how rarely they can combine the two. Today is a film on the Seleção. We'll see the glorious failures that belong to Socrates, Zico and Falcao, but we'll also document the glories that straddled both sides of the coin, the perfection of Pelé and the brutish yet successful football of Dunga and Gilberto Silva. Football washed up on Brazilian shores thanks to who else but the English, who were busy repatriating the sport through all 4 corners of the globe in the late 19th century. Therefore, only those with a large expenditure were able to introduce football to Brazil, and much like everywhere else on earth, the sport would take some time to shift through the social classes. Football was late to the Brazilian sporting party. In Rio de Janeiro, for example, horse racing was the most prominent sport and had been attracting tens of thousands since the 1810s. By the latter part of the 19th century, even rowing was more prevalent than football. Much less than in neighbouring Argentina and Uruguay, British influence appeared to begin and end with its introduction to Sao Paulo. Charles Miller, a former Southampton footballer, delivered football to Sao Paulo, but by the 1920s, emigration to Brazil was so high and so diverse that the English voice when it came to football was drowned out. Over 4 million from Europe emigrated to Brazil in the 40 years preceding the First World War, with large expat groups from Italy, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Switzerland and France in great numbers. New social classes from the urban middle class and an expanding working class helped drive the sport. Whilst Rio and Sao Paulo were at the forefront, Porto Alegre founded 2 behemoths, Grêmio and Internacional, in quick succession, as the game spread to Belo Horizonte, Salvador and Recife. The sport had infiltrated the media of art, poetry and letter writing, and there was no going back. In 1914, a first Brazilian 11 was cobbled together to beat a touring Exeter City 2-0, before a first official international was played later that year in defeat to Argentina. Tactically, there is much debate as to who supercharged Brazil's footballing development. Dori Kirshner is often cited as the leading candidate who appeared to deliver the Hungarian brand, as so many Hungarians were doing worldwide. Even if tactically Brazil didn't fully adapt to his version of the WM, he, alongside compatriot Imre Herschel, were paramount in the country's footballing development. Whilst another Hungarian, Bela Gutmann, claimed to have introduced Brazil to the 4-2-4 whilst managing Sao Paulo, probably the more pertinent names tactically are Gentil Cardoso and Flavio Costa. Cardoso stuck true to the original WM, whilst Flavio Costa would implement the diagonal, a slightly tweaked version of the formation during the 1950 World Cup. Speaking of tournaments, Brazil were fairly efficient in an age where the River Plate nations of Argentina and Uruguay were at their fiercest. They swept to the Copa America triumphs of 1919 and 1922 off the backs of multiculturalism from Europe and Africa. Yet a continuous bone of contention came with the fielding of black players. Brazilian President Epitácio Pessoa announced on the eve of the 1921 edition of the Copa America that no black players would be fielded. It is the problem of segregation that rumbled on as one of Brazil's major footballing problems. Even at the 1930 World Cup, Brazil toiled with an all-white team. Despite defeating fellow South Americans Bolivia, Brazil crashed out of the group phase to Yugoslavia. By 1932, alongside the increasingly loud question of professionalism, Brazil were reaching an impasse, especially so once their two premier black players, Leonidas and Domingos, left for Uruguayan teams Peñarol and Nacional. Dori Kirshner, influential enough, was the man to bring them both back to Brazil and to a successful Flamengo side that also included Fausto, another black player. The integration of black players into Brazilian club football is a turning point for the country's game. They were already at risk from outside forces. In 1931, Italian agents hoovered up the best talent from Corinthians, essentially handicapping them, as well as the national team. In the second edition of the World Cup, Brazil were eliminated at the first stage yet again, this time to Spain in a straight knockout contest. However, nobody really seemed to notice or care except for some supporters who rioted against the fact that Italian Brazilians chose to represent the successful Italians instead of Brazil. 4 years later, all Brazil's games were broadcast live on the radio from France, and since the tournament was staged in Europe yet again, Brazil were the only South Americans in attendance. With the glare of its country's spotlight, it was a good job that Brazil played up. Dori Kirshner attempted to ape world champions Italy's tactical system, the Metodo, or WW, as opposed to the WM, which had become increasingly fashionable. Leonidas was the bicycle-kicking star, led by his former Flamengo manager Kirshner, and he would net Brazil's first World Cup hat-trick in a ridiculous first-round victory over Poland, 6-5. The subsequent quarter-final against Czechoslovakia was a scrap, won after a replay when the first descended into the violence of a broken leg and 3 players sent off. By the semi-finals, however, overconfidence crept in, as Brazilian officials booked a full plane to fly themselves out to Paris for the final. Leonidas would ultimately miss Brazil's glorious failure, as the Seleção were outclassed by the defending and eventual champions Italy. In comparison to the Europeans' game, Brazil were a breath of fresh air and must have stuck out like a sore thumb in the field of Europeans who all are largely attempted to play by similar methods. It is from here onwards where the stereotype of Brazilians and their football largely inclusive of individuality, spontaneous skills and tricks developed. But as the world waged war, Flavio Costa was waging a tactical revolution in Brazil. It all ended in the country's first FIFA World Cup final. The 1940s were here, and some in Brazilian football were doing something a little bit different. At this time, there was a split between those behind the times, playing a 2-3-5, the others who wanted to shore up defence with a third defender in a 3-2-5, and the Galaxy Brains who opted to develop the WM formation. That is in number speak 3-2-2-3. Whilst in Italy some opted for a WW, that is 3-2-3-2, Flamengo's manager Flavio Costa ripped up the rulebook by implementing a formation known as the diagonal, a riff off the WW Metodo system from Italy. His system allowed for the flexibility that none of the aforementioned systems allowed. One of the 3 defenders could go forward, but it meant that the adjacent winger would drop, and in the central area of the pitch between the 2 players, there was a more staggered midfield 4. His work at Flamengo earned Flavio Costa the national team job in 1944, and 5 years later, they romped to a 3rd Copa America crown, scoring 46 goals in the process. In that championship, Paraguay were mauled 7-0 in the proxy final, whilst Uruguay were brutally disposed of 5-1, and twice more in preparation for the World Cup. These successes helped to spread the footballing bug in Brazil, and essentially built the foundations of the country's obsession. Next on the horizon, the 4th staging of the FIFA World Cup, this time on home soil. It was supposed to be a period of great optimism. The Maracanã was constructed for the tournament, holding a whopping 200,000 people, and was a testament to the progressing and modernity of Brazil as a country. It was the biggest cathedral that the sport could offer, at the biggest tournament that the sport could offer, hosted by a country that was quickly becoming the best that the sport offered. It was a country expected to win. Yet, it is a World Cup that Brazilian playwright Nelson Rodrigues called a catastrophe and likened it to Brazil's version of Hiroshima, whilst anthropologist Roberto de Mata labelled it the greatest tragedy in the country's contemporary history. And it all started perfectly, Ademir netting 2 of Brazil's 4 in a rout over Mexico. Flavio Costa had attempted to soothe the long-standing rift between players of Rio and Sao Paulo origin by implementing an all-Sao Paulo midfield against Switzerland, which resulted in a tepid 2-2 draw. With one team progressing from each of the 4 groups, Brazil had to defeat 1948 Olympic silver medalist Yugoslavia in the final group match. Zizinho and Ademir combined for the goals, laying the ghosts of 20 years prior to rest. Through to a final group phase, Brazil met Spain and Sweden and stuck a combined 13 goals beyond them. The Seleção were destroying their opposition despite the weight of expectations, and now they only needed a draw to win the tournament. In the final group game that acted as the proxy final, Brazil met a Uruguayan team who benefited from the withdrawals of France and Scotland. Therefore, La Celeste only faced 1 first-round match as opposed to 3 and dispatched of Bolivia 8-0. Brazil's hosting of the tournament allowed them to even up the odds, as they remained in the Maracanã throughout the final stage, as the others had to be ferried back and forth from Rio to Sao Paulo. Whilst Uruguay had few expectations and a more relaxing build-up, however, the Brazilians' camp was frenzied with both the throngs of supporters and well-wishers, as well as the anxiety of needing to succeed. In an attempt to escape the hustle and bustle of their hotel, Brazil pitched up to the Maracanã. It proved an exercise in leaping from frying pan into fire, as they found 200,000 supporters waiting for them. That is 20% of the adult Rio de Janeiro populace in 1950. The city's mayor, Mendes de Moraes, didn't do much to help when he took to the field to make a speech pre-match. He declared, "You players who in less than a few hours will be hailed as champions by millions of compatriots, you who have no rivals in the entire hemisphere." Despite the ramping up of the country's tensions and pressures, Brazil's dream appeared to be comfortably coming true as late as the 47th minute, when Freisa broke the finals deadlock. Whilst Brazil weren't advancing up the pitch with the same might, they still left gaps in defence, and Uruguay responded after the hour mark with an equaliser from Juan Alberto Schiaffino. Before the cruelest of blows, with 11 minutes remaining. Brazil was still winning the World Cup as it stood when Alcides Gigia raced to the byline. Given his positioning, Moacir Barbosa understandably adopted a position that aimed to cut out the expectant cross. Only the cross never came. Only the cross was a shot that Gigia had snuck between goalkeeper and front post. Uruguay won the match 2-1 and the World Cup. Despite being named the tournament's best goalkeeper, Barbosa was vilified for the rest of his life. In early 2000, he remarked, "In Brazil, the most you get for a crime is 30 years. For 50 years, I've been paying for a crime I did not commit. Even a criminal, when he has paid his debt, is forgiven, but I have never been forgiven." He died later that year. Jules Rimet spoke of a morbid silence that became too difficult to bear when a mass of almost 250,000 people stood aghast. There were reports of supporters committing suicide as an entire nation mourned. Somewhere in Brazil, though, a 9-year-old child and his father held each other and sobbed. Little did that child know it at the time, but he would be the one to finally lift the Jules Rimet trophy aloft in canary yellow. The shirts only became canary yellow after Brazil's all-white strip was banished shortly after the Maracanazo of 1950. Brazil wouldn't play a game of football until the Pan American Championship of 1952, almost 2 years after the World Cup. They wouldn't return to the scene of the crime until a 1954 World Cup qualifier against Chile in February 1954. In fact, that game would be the Seleção's first in Brazil since that fateful final of 1950. A competition was organised for a new kit to incorporate the colours of the Brazilian flag, and a teenager by the name of Aldair Schlee won it. Ironically enough, Schlee lived near the border with Uruguay and was one of the very few inside Brazil celebrating Uruguay's win in 1950. It took a long time for Brazil to heal from the wounds of the Maracanã, as the more defensively renowned Zezé Moreira took the reins from Flavio Costa. It was an almost entirely new team, with Zezinho overlooked and two stars of the prior World Cup in Ademir and Jair quitting the national team. The more exciting players lining up for the Seleção in Switzerland were defenders Djalma Santos and Nilton Santos. Brazil again proved too strong for Mexico, thrashing them 5-0 before the notoriously tricky Yugoslavians generated a draw after extra time. The 1954 World Cup was a peculiar one. Right from the group games settled after extra time in the event of a draw, to the fact that the teams only played 2 group matches in a 4-team group, as well as another fact that killed the Seleção's tournament. Bizarrely, group winners would be pitted against other group winners, so in essence Brazil were punished for prevailing in their group by being drawn against tournament favourites Hungary. In reality, had they finished second in the group, their quarter-final opponents would have been eventual winners, West Germany, anyway. What ought to have been a display of beautiful football between two great teams devolved into a contest famously known as the Battle of Bern. Hungary and Brazil were reduced to fighting, and it wasn't curtailed by the final whistle, as managers were attacked, dressing room doors broken down, and at the end of it all, Brazil were left bruised by both the violence and their 4-2 demise in the quarter-final. With the brawling of Bern left in Switzerland, Brazil returned to Europe a different team in 1958. The biggest thing to happen to them in 1958 was not the World Cup staging, but the acquisition of João Havelange. The businessman from Rio, entrenched at Fluminense, was voted in as president of the CBF by 185 votes to 19 and organised Brazil's campaign in Sweden. The Seleção had slowly turned to the 4-2-4, and with it came the prominence of attacking fullbacks in the form of 1954 star Djalma Santos. He'd soon be overshadowed by 2 younger models though. DD had only just qualified Brazil for the tournament via Peru and was rewarded for that by nearly being omitted from the tournament squad. The player, feared by some to be too old and unmotivated, ascended to be one of the key players, alongside Joel, Zito, Pepe and Vava, who had all turned out for the country in Switzerland. Their tournament was inaugurated with a workmanlike triumph over Austria before a scoreless draw against the English in Gothenburg. With England and the Soviet Union still in contention for the knockout phase, Brazil had to defeat the latter to top the group. Only then were Pelé and Garrincha granted World Cup football. Both were deemed by the team's psychologist to have too low an IQ to play in the tournament at such a young age. Manager Vicente Fiola wasn't completely sold on Garrincha, and whilst Pelé had missed the opening games largely through injury, it's safe to say that both players played a starring role in the remainder of the tournament. The 2-0 victory over the Soviets was arguably Brazil's greatest in World Cup history, before Wales proved a struggle in the quarter-finals. The Welsh resistance was finally broken down in the second half thanks to the first World Cup goal from the teenaged Pelé. If that was a triumph enough, then contenders France were simply swatted aside 5-2 in the semi-final as Pelé bagged himself a hat-trick. His Santos coach Lula said of the forward, "Pelé can no longer be compared to anyone else because he possesses all the qualities of the ideal football player. He is fast on the ground and in the air. He has the kick, the physique, the ball control, the ability to dictate play, a feeling for the manoeuvre. He is unselfish, good-natured and modest." With France thrashed, host Sweden were next. Whilst not an elite name by today's standards, under the control of George Rayner, the Scandinavians had proved successful in the Olympics and were a strong force in European football. The Swedes' English manager had speculated that when Brazil finally fell behind in a match at the tournament, that they would wilt. Niels lined home enacted Rainer's wishes, opening the scoring in the final after 4 minutes, but the prophecy wouldn't come true. Instead, Sweden were treated to the same punishment doled out to France as Pelé scored another 2 goals in another 5-2 humbling. The best team had won, which some may argue wasn't the case 8 years prior. The Times described Brazil's football as a different conception from their European adversaries. Such was Brazil's performance that the King of Sweden came to join the festivities pitchside, whilst the Swedes in attendance applauded the victory. Preparations 4 years on, led once again by João Havelange, were rigorous yet again, as altitude training became a component of the Seleção's build-up ahead of the tournament in Chile. Tactically, the slight tweak of Mario Zagallo dropping deeper on the left wing ensured that Brazil effectively deployed a 4-3-3. This was reaffirmed with Pelé's replacement Amarildo being fielded slightly deeper as well. After another triumph over Mexico to open up the tournament, Pelé went down in a 0-0 against the much-fancied Czechoslovakia. Yet, in his absence, Garrincha was the star of the show, with Vava, Amarildo and Zito more than stepping up to the plate. Amarildo's double sunk Spain and won the Seleção the group, whilst Garrincha settled the quarter-final with a 3-1 victory over England. Unfortunately, Vicente Feola wouldn't emulate Vittorio Pozzo, as he was ill and replaced by Aimore Moreira prior to the tournament. After the win over England, it almost became a formality that Brazil would retain the trophy. The only thing that could potentially stop Brazil was Brazil themselves. In the latter stages of a semi-final dominance over host Chile, Garrincha was sent off 5 minutes from the conclusion after kicking out at an opponent. A scramble was on for Brazil to field their star player for the final against Czechoslovakia. The Brazilians won their case, leaning on the Peruvian president and his ambassador for Chile to persuade the Peruvian referee to rescind his decision. He did so, and Garrincha was a crucial component of the 3-1 victory over Czechoslovakia. Garrincha couldn't be more unlike Pelé if he tried. He was unmoved and unmotivated by football, forced by his friends to go to trials so he could start his career. He was carefree and unambitious. Whilst Pelé lived the life of a model citizen on and off the field, Garrincha ate and drank to excess, much like the populace in his factory worker upbringing. Whilst Pelé was O Rei, the king, Garrincha was Alegre de Povo, the joy of the people. Sweden and Chile was a turning point for football in Brazil. The sport was now the main ritual and pastime in the country. The national team would now project the health of the country, and everybody had become obsessed. They had gotten rid of the complex, and not just won, but had won in style. Brazil the football team couldn't have been on a higher note. Brazil the country was in a shambles. They were printing too much money, leaving a runaway inflation rate at over 100% by 1964, the year the military was forced to step in and key governmental offices in Rio and Brasilia were occupied. Whilst they wouldn't change the Seleção immediately, it was only around the corner. Before then, Vicente Feola was back as manager, and Brazil were favourites to make it 3 World Cups in a row. Up front, Pelé had won his first World Cups as a teenager and as a young adult. Now he was in his peak and had led Santos to the greatest glories in the South American and world game. He was without injury and opened his account in England 15 minutes into Brazil's first group match against Bulgaria. Unfortunately, it was the best it ever got for Pelé at the 1966 World Cup. Bulgaria viciously attacked him again and again and kicked him out of the subsequent match with Hungary. Without Pelé, Brazil were down 3-1, but the forward would return for the all-or-nothing clash with Portugal to decide who would participate in the knockouts. Youth was entrusted against Hungary as Gerson and Tostão were used, and veterans in the shape of Jaume Santos and Garrincha shouldn't have been risked in consecutive games. They were undone by Bené and Florian Albert. Hungary were far from their magical Magyar's peak, but still had a serviceable team. The third match against Portugal should have offered Pelé relative protection against a stronger team with more beauty, fronted by Eusebio. Brazil made 7 changes ahead of the contest, jettisoning the older guard that included Jaume Santos and Garrincha. Once again though, Pelé was kicked out of the game as Portugal resorted to the same underhanded tactics as the Bulgarians to win 3-1. Brazil were out at the first phase. Pelé vowed never to play in the World Cup ever again. And he wouldn't play for his country again until 1968. Around the same time, the Seleção came under the control of João Saldanha, and a successful string of results made him near untouchable ahead of the World Cup in Mexico. Yet, he allowed one line to kill his career as Brazil manager. Upon dropping Pelé for a preparation game with Chile 4 months prior to the World Cup, Saldanha stated that Pelé wasn't the player he once was. Safe to say he was sacked. He would be replaced by former Seleção player and Pelé teammate Mario Zagallo. By this point, football was wholly ubiquitous in Brazilian life. The club game was at its peak, most of the players were in their pomp, and almost every social class and society was drawn to the sport. The championship deciding game of 1963 between bitter rivals Flamengo and Fluminense drew 200,000 to the Maracanã, as Flamengo regularly drew upon attendances of six figures in the 1960s. If supporters weren't lucky enough to be in attendance, it was only until the 1970s that supporters would flock to the television. Radio had been the medium through which Brazil had commiserated solemnly in 1950 and celebrated wildly in both 1958 and 1962. A new age was upon Brazil, a colourful age had dawned on Earth, and it wasn't solely because the World Cup in Mexico was the first to be broadcast live and in living colour. It was partly the fault of the Seleção themselves. Physical conditioning had to be corrected in Mexico, so preparations were stringent once again as the Seleção would hire Claudio Coutinho and made him responsible. He adopted a NASA training program to get the Brazilians up to speed. Tactically, Zagallo didn't need to change much, sticking to Saldanha's 4-2-4 as it wasn't broken, whilst many of the players who lined up for the former manager were utilised. Gerson returned to be more than a squad member that he was in 1966, Rivellino and Jairzinho were the shiniest new attacking toys, and Pelé returned to the starting 11. Tostão suffered a brutal eye injury the year prior to the tournament, but held off his eventual premature retirement and featured heavily in Mexico. The Czechs, previously a vicious stumbling block, were destroyed in the opening game as Rivellino opened Brazil's account to equalise and Jairzinho netted the third and fourth, kickstarting a sequence of scoring in every single game. Despite it being the second group phase match 4 days later in Guadalajara, it took on the importance of the final itself. The champions were to play the holders, and many declared England even stronger than in 1966. Whilst the contest wouldn't attain the heights of Brazil's other historical World Cup games or even at this very tournament, it lives on in legend. From Bobby Moore's tackle on Jairzinho to Gordon Banks' save from Pelé, Jairzinho's winner often gets lost in the shuffle of a momentous 1-0 win. Romania was between Brazil and the simple passage to group winners, achieved via the means of a 3-2 triumph. Winning the group, unlike in 1954 though, was clearly a blessing for the Seleção. Had they been funneled into the bottom half of the draw, Brazil would have faced the prior World Cup's finalists and either the European champions or hosts. Instead, their prize for winning the group was a Peru side playing at their first World Cup in 40 years, and then Uruguay, whose global successes were but a distant memory. Tostão, Rivellino and Jairzinho swore off Peru before Clodoaldo joined the latter two in scoring the goals in another simple rout over the South American opposition, Uruguay. They'd taken the game efficiently away from Uruguay in the second half of a needlessly violent contest. They'd do the same to Italy in the final 4 days later after a roughly even first 45 minutes. The match became Brazil's magnum opus as a footballing nation. Pelé netted 1 and assisted 2, with his final meaningful act in a World Cup being the impeccable layoff to round off perhaps the greatest goal ever scored in the sport by Carlos Alberto. 4-1, the European champions were decimated, and if the best team had won in 1958 and 1962, it was now undeniable that Brazil's third global triumph was better than they or anybody had ever done it before or since. Even the more sober of publications had been stretched to describe this game with the most colourful language and metaphors. Ronaldo Brazil went to the lengths to compare the final's importance and the swashbuckling Brazilian spirit to the moon landings of the prior year. Brazil, perhaps the only country on Earth that didn't wholly lead with the story in July 1969 that humans had set foot on the moon. You see, the very same day, Pelé scored his oft-disputed 1,000th professional goal, so Neil Armstrong and co had to take up joint billing in the column inches in Brazil that day. Brazil had won the FIFA World Cup before, but to do so in such a perfect manner only now as Pelé got his hands on the Jules Rimet trophy for the eternally record third time did the trauma of 1950 dissipate. Brazil, the dictatorship, had gotten incredibly fortunate by the contrasting style to how their national football team had romped to the World Cup in 1970, as fires raged on back home. They ensured that the Seleção would never have it so good again, at least not until after they were gone. The militia had temporarily gotten a handle on inflation and, having done so, came after footballers for unpaid tax. Prior to the 1966 World Cup, João Havelange had to come to Garrincha's aid to pay his tax bill so he could play in the tournament. On the football pitch, Brazil couldn't be beaten. Off it, they left a lot to be desired, and in the early 70s, the uprising of protests and strikes were commenced before being quickly quashed. Due to the South American Championship taking a 7-year hiatus between 1967 and its rebirth as the Copa America in 1975, Brazil didn't play a competitive game between the 1970 World Cup final and their opener in 1974. Qualifying as holders Jairzinho, Rivellino and Piazza were the only survivors from the previous final to make the cut in West Germany. Pelé had famously retired in July 1971. Clodoaldo, Gerson and Carlos Alberto missed out through injury, whilst Tostão's fledgling career was curtailed abruptly. Yet perhaps the greatest departure came off the field, as João Havelange ascended to FIFA presidency on the eve of the tournament. With that came his backseat role in organising the tournament and the changing figureheads at the CBF, which included Admiral Heleno Nunes. The Seleção ultimately only escaped the first group phase after bettering Scotland's result against Zaire by a solitary goal. Brazil's 3-0 victory over the African debutants came after two uninspiring 0-0 stalemates with the Tartan Army, as well as Yugoslavia. They remained cautious in the second group phase, victorious against East Germany, and they were somewhat competent in their first ever World Cup meeting with Argentina. But when it came to the crunch, effectively in a semi-final with Johan Cruyff's Netherlands, Brazil were outclassed. It was a perfect passing of the torch from Joga Bonito and into the total football of the 1970s. Brazil were in a danger of being left behind, and by 1978, the military had run unabated through Brazilian football. The sport had become assimilated into O Grande Brasil, the revamping of the country. Structures like those enormous concrete balls of the Maracanã in Rio and in Belo Horizonte popped up everywhere, from places that needed it in Natal and Fortaleza, and to those that didn't in Manaus and Teresina, all bought and paid for by the government. Mario Zagallo was gone after the pitiful performance in Germany, to be replaced by Osvaldo Brandão. Now more than ever, it was obvious that the military was now in control of the team. Admiral Nunes proved heavily influential in team selection, and after Brandão resigned before the World Cup, the dour Claudio Coutinho was drafted in. Brazil was miserable yet again. Coutinho was the microcosm for the grim reality under which Brazilians had come to live in under the dictatorship. Whilst they'd reached the bronze medal match at the 1976 Olympics, Brazil underachieved yet again at a World Cup. Admiral Nunes' favourite player, Roberto Dinamite, was given preferential treatment as Zico and Rivellino stewed in their unhappiness, and Reinaldo came into the tournament unfit. Their version of total football was completely botched, and it showed. They were unfortunate to draw against Sweden owing to the grave mistake by referee Clive Thomas in blowing for full time as a Brazilian corner was headed into the net. Then Brazil proved lucky to draw against Spain, and via a dour 1-0 win over Austria, the Seleção had somehow returned to the semi-final group phase. There they threatened to kick on, dispatching of Peru comfortably 3-0, as well as defeating Poland 3-1 in their best performance of the tournament thus far. However, it was a triumph that came far too late to prove impactful. Brazil's draw against Argentina, combined with the hosts playing their final game after the Seleção, spelled their end for the tournament. La Albiceleste knew they needed a 4-goal victory over the Peruvians, scored 6 and dumped Brazil out. The formatting was deeply unfair, and Brazil were the only team in the entire tournament not to lose a game, so the excuses were already baked in. Yet it is hard to argue a case for the Seleção deserving to qualify for the final ahead of Argentina. By the early 1980s, it appeared as though a transference of power from the military government and back to the civilian was around the corner. Naturally, this was borne out in the country's football. Footballers were beginning to rally against the system, largely through the work of Corinthians and namely through midfielder Socrates. It is through the work of Socrates and others on the pitch where Brazil shone in the 80s. The military government was increasingly founded on flimsier foundations as inflation ran rampant, returning to over 100% by 1980. By the time the military were forced to concede 5 years later, it had doubled. By the time that reprieve came, cold Brazilian hands warmed themselves on the fire of football art, being played in Spain by Socrates, Edo, Falcao and the like. Brazil had seen Cesar Luis Menotti flagrantly ignore Europe by playing World Cup football his way for Argentina, and was successful. Only after Coutinho was sacked after failing to win the 1979 Copa America could Brazil do the same. The following year, Tele Santana was hired, and whilst they got off to a bad start with a draw against the Soviet Union, the seeds of their brilliant football were sown in 1981. After a European tour where victories were gleaned away to West Germany, France and England, Brazil's might ought to have been obvious. Out of tradition, they were installed as World Cup favourites. Tele Santana brought back the offensive fullbacks in a big way through Junior and Leandro, making up for what potentially could have been a lack of width from a box midfield. However, the quartet of Socrates, Zico, Falcao and Toninho Cerezo was so fluid and so interchangeable that it never became a problem. The Soviets, once a stern test for Tele Santana's team, wilted in the Spanish heat as the Seleção crashed goal after goal beyond them. After this imperious display, Bobby Charlton predicted that whoever beats the Brazilians is going to win the World Cup. The next contest saw yet another wonderful goal scored in a Brazil match, only it was Scotland's David Neri who funded the opening volley in. All that achieved was to stoke the flames of the Seleção as they ran rampant once more, before sticking another 5 goals beyond New Zealand to complete the most comprehensive World Cup group stage performance imaginable. The infinite wisdom of FIFA dreamed up another second group phase, where now 3 teams competed for one semi-final spot. Thankfully for the Seleção, they would share the last game of the group and wouldn't be a victim to the pitfalls of 1978 when their opponents could gain the upper hand on them. Unfortunately, Brazil were drawn into quite possibly the deathliest group in World Cup history, paired off with reigning champions Argentina and Italy. Unlike in Argentina, Brazil ran rampant against their Super Classico opponents in their best performance yet. With Italy to come and Brazil needing just the 1 point from the game, the Seleção were once again tipped to come through the challenge to reach the knockouts. After all, Italy hadn't won a single game in the first phase and had only qualified on goals scored. Their inferior goal difference meant they had to chase the game to qualify for the semi-final, and with a blunt Paolo Rossi up front, Brazil ought to have had enough to progress. Rossi had struggled to return to speed after the ending of his 2-year ban for his alleged part in the Totonero scandal. It didn't show as he romped to a hat-trick in a match that defied any attempt at a description. Brazil's 3-2 defeat to Italy and subsequent exit stands alongside any World Cup match. From the France vs West Germany effort a week later in the semi-final, to Italy's very own semi-final against the Germans in 1970, as well as Hungary and Uruguay's classic from 1954. The whole world had been enchanted with Brazil as Tele Santana reminded them in Barcelona upon their elimination against Italy. The post-mortem was that Careca might have proved the difference up front had he not been injured, whilst some chastised not picking Batista in the starting 11 for a more solid midfield. The draw for the 1986 World Cup in Mexico was made the December prior, and Brazil had rattled through 4 managers since Tele Santana, only to wind up back where they once were. Carlos Alberto Pereira was the first, and he took the Seleção to the 1983 Copa America, where they lost to Uruguay. Zico's brother Edu was subsequently made manager, but didn't last much longer after losing to England in the Maracanã, thanks to that special John Barnes goal. Next, Evaristo, who was designed to take charge for the 1986 qualifiers and lead the country into the World Cup, or at least that was the idea, as Tele Santana was quickly persuaded to reassume his role in June 1985. Santana and his good football was back, the mood of the country was starting to look up too. The first democratically elected president in a generation was chosen, and for the first time in nearly 30 years could Brazil combine beauty both on and off the football field. But it wasn't exactly the perfectly prepared World Cup team as it was 16 years prior in the same country. None of the famous box midfield of Zico, Falcao, Toninho and Socrates were 100% going into the tournament. Furthermore, Leandro refused to turn up after Santana had banished his friend Renato Gaucho from the squad. Consequently, this was a Brazil that didn't set the world alight in their opening wins against Spain and Algeria, as Falcao played his final game for Brazil against the latter. Only when paired off with Northern Ireland and the new 16-team knockout phase against Poland did Brazil come to life. The quarter-final opponents were France, the European champions. Brazil's box midfield would meet France's Karim Magique of Luis Fernandez, Alain Giresse, Jean Tigana and Michel Platini that had beautifully dismantled the field at Euro 1984. Contested in the heat of the midday sun, Brazil begun brightly by scoring, only for the brilliant Platini to peg them back. The match and Brazil's World Cup would hinge on penalties. First, Zico was denied in normal time, despite both Socrates and Careca being on the pitch and having a recent history of scoring World Cup penalties. Then the Seleção were eliminated from 12 yards by the French. It was the day the art died in Brazil. With the dictatorship in the rearview mirror, Brazil began to climb out of the wreckage slowly and in discomfort. In their scant surroundings, they searched for their inspiration and they followed the trail of their recently departed stars to Europe for it. With the sweeper system baked into European football by 1990, Brazil uncharacteristically followed suit. Sebastião Lazzaroni was of the militaristic ilk that came before him, with a preference for preparation and muscle as opposed to the individuality and guile that Brazilian football was founded on. A 3-5-2 was deployed, which utilised Brazil's penchant for an attacking wing-back, but outside of that, it was a tactic that served to hinder the Seleção. Once again, the camp wasn't happy either with the ructions between star players Dunga and Careca. The latter proved brilliant in the opening win against Sweden before Brazil took to squeezing through the lesser challengers of Costa Rica and Scotland to progress from the group. It was a World Cup performance that had Brazil frothing with anger. 3-time World Cup winner as player and manager Mario Zagallo proclaimed that Lazzaroni had betrayed Brazilian football before stating that Corinthians Neto should have gone to the tournament. Added to the fact that Romario came into the tournament undercooked after breaking his leg in March, Brazil's demise was timed to the meeting of their first strong opponent. It is a source of irony that in Brazil's best performance at Italia 90, it would see to their elimination. In the third meeting between Brazil and Argentina at the World Cup, the Seleção took to the underhanded tactics in which they lamented the Portuguese and Bulgarians for in 1966, as they kicked Diego Maradona at every opportunity. Despite Dunga, Careca and Muller all squandering chances to score, It was a half-fit Maradona who laid on the only goal of the game for Claudio Caniggia as Argentina won out 1-0. It was the first time since 1966 that Brazil had been eliminated from the last 16 stage of a World Cup. Carlos Alberto Pereira returned to the role of Seleção manager in preparation for the 1994 World Cup. He set out his stall instantly by announcing, "We will play in the way modern football demands. Magic and dreams are finished in football. We have to combine technique and efficiency." He turned to Mario Zagallo as an advisor, yet despite the promises, only 10% of the Brazilian public believed they could win it. In preparation, Brazil lost their first ever World Cup qualifier, admittedly away to Bolivia, who also qualified at altitude. The Brazilian mood had sagged. Ayrton Senna had lost his life in a Formula 1 race the prior month, and Pereira's footballing schematics of the 4-4-2 with a robust midfield of Dunga and Mauro Silva hardly set pulses racing. Up front, however, Brazil had two attackers they could pin all their hopes on, Bebeto and Romario. The latter's place in the team was secured last minute after a fallout between player and manager was patched over. Brazil had returned to what was ostensibly a 4-2-2-2, but that was where the similarities between 1994 and 1982 ended. The Seleção didn't blow away any of their group opposition. They couldn't even secure wins from all three of their group fixtures and had to contend with a slew of defenders going down to injury. After a 1-1 draw with Sweden, O Globo's headline shamefully muttered, "Show of incompetence." As the comfort of the group phase became the crunch time of the knockouts, however, Bebeto and Romario bailed Brazil out. They snuck through against the disappointing host United States despite the fact that Leonardo broke a man's skull with his elbow and was sent off. Bebeto saved the day with a late goal there. He cradled the baby, thankfully for the offside remaining at the assistant's side as Brazil cruised into a 2-goal lead in the quarter-final against the Netherlands. Any resemblance of a comfortable victory was ruined by a 12-minute Dutch double salvo. Thankfully, Branco saved the day with a late goal there. In the semi-final, Sweden didn't prove as strong a test as they had done in the group, yet Brazil only found themselves in the final thanks to a red card for the opponent and a Romario winner 10 minutes from time. In Brazil's first World Cup final for 24 years, Romario only just passed fit after surviving a groin strain. Kicking off at 12:30 PM local time in 36-degree heat, it is no wonder that the game ground to a halt upon the beckoning of 30 extra minutes after a goalless draw. As Roberto Baggio skied his penalty over and Brazil were handed their fourth World Cup, it is notable that the great display of their fourth World Cup triumph wasn't any individual skill or great goal-scoring might, but the pivotal defensive midfield performance of Mauro Silva. With the turn of the millennium approaching, the promise of Brazil returned to the fore with the development of key players such as Ronaldinho, Rivaldo, Cafu, Roberto Carlos and, last but by absolutely no means least, the poster boy, Ronaldo. The success of the Seleção hinged on the phenomenon as money poured into the CBF through a record-breaking sponsorship deal with Nike, who were also largely tied to Ronaldo. It quadrupled the federation's income, but was routinely wasted on a footballing level, with the football budget the only financial metric to shrink in the meantime. On the surface, Brazilian football never looked better. They qualified for 3 successive World Cup finals as the club game crumbled in the background. Their best players emigrated to Europe at an alarming rate, the attendance base at club level had halved and violence at games had increased. Ronaldo lit up France 98 before falling foul to a seizure on the morning of the final as the Seleção were thrashed by their hosts. After spending a tortuous 3 of the next 4 years on the sidelines, R9 burst back onto the scene in the Far East, winning the Golden Boot and winning Brazil their 5th World Cup. The 4 years ached by at a glacial pace, filled by CBF scandal. The federation were investigated for their dealings with Nike, a case that rumbled on for 3 years. Meanwhile, national coach Vanderlei Luxemburgo himself appeared under suspicion for earning cuts from football deals. Luxemburgo proved unsuccessful from the dugout, overseeing Brazil's loss at the Sydney Olympics to a 9-man Cameroon. Luis Felipe Scolari stepped into the breach, survived a Copa America elimination at the hands of Honduras before earning the country's 5th star. By the time he returned to oversee the 2014 World Cup on home soil, Brazil had won a couple more Copa Americas before lurching into the 3rd act of the European trilogy. The quartet of Adriano, Kaká, Ronaldo, Ronaldinho were tactically unfit at the 2006 World Cup, where the only highlight was Ronaldo's breaking of Gerd Muller's World Cup scoring record in Germany. 2010 was distinctly worse. Luis Fabiano now led the line, and with more onus placed on Kaká and Robinho, the dour football was scapegoated by a quarter-final performance of one player, Felipe Melo, who scored an own goal and lost his head by being sent off against the Netherlands. Brazil had invited more pressure onto themselves with the hosting of the 2014 World Cup. Reckless money was splashed on stadia, whilst promised transport links never materialised. People protested and rioted across both the 2013 Confederations Cup and 2014 World Cup, as travel fares rose dramatically and the people wondered why the magic money tree could be found for football stadiums and not on the country's infrastructure. Nothing prepared the country, though, for the disaster on the pitch. Led by poster boy Neymar, Brazil had completed a serviceable group phase with 7 points ahead of Croatia, Cameroon and Mexico, before the fortunate progression against Chile on penalties. Whilst the quarter-final hurdle was navigated with some semblance of style against Colombia, the seeds of Brazil's eventual elimination were sown when Neymar was ruled out with injury. The nation mourned, and ahead of the semi-final against Germany, the players publicly mourned Neymar's absence. The emotion had finally gotten better of Brazil. Then, as the country were left reeling by a shocking 7-1 evisceration by Germany, it became apparent that Thiago Silva was the player they truly missed. Further salt was rubbed into the wounds when Miroslav Klose broke Ronaldo's World Cup goal-scoring record during the match. Attempts to bring back Joga Bonito or football art have since failed, as Brazil have fallen at the all-too-familiar hurdles at the very sight of European opposition in the knockout phase. The Seleção haven't beaten a European team in the World Cup knockout since the winning of their 5th title in 2002. They have overcome the hurdles of Ghana in 2006, Chile in 2010, Chile again and Colombia in 2014, Mexico in 2018 and South Korea in 2022. But as soon as a France, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium or Croatia stand across from the Seleção, they wilt. They say football is now almost homogenous tactically, that the world is smaller, that there are no new ideas, that almost every team goes out of their way to try play like Brazil once did. Brazil haven't been Brazil for a long time. They've had a few flashes here and there through generational talent like a Neymar or a Ronaldo, but the team hasn't played with an abandon collectively since the 1980s. With Carlo Ancelotti's presence as potentially the next Brazil manager skulking in the shadows, those days of abandon may be postponed still further. Or maybe caretaker manager Fernando Diniz and his anti-positional football, which necessitates individuality, will usher in a new wave of football art.